Okay, great. Thank you so much for I cannot express how much the depth of my gratitude for all of you who organized this very complex symposium, and for those of you who come to join us. And I'm just going to dive in. And thank you, Reza, for mentioning my beloved mentor, supervisor, Henry Allison. And he has a special place in my heart, and I carry him in my heart throughout this whole process of working through some of these difficult topics. And I also want to say that Henry Allison was very supportive of this project, even though we could have disagreed over a lot of substantive points. He always said to me, whenever I had some doubts about my projects, he would always say, what is not controversial is not worth saying. So I'm going to say a lot of controversial things, and my intention is always to invite fruitful conversations. Okay. All right. So I'm also very intentional about colors. I love colors. And so the main colors on this slide are blue and yellow. For me, blue symbolizes soberness, and yellow symbolizes hope. And so the blue part is the truth part. The yellow part is the reconciliation part. I always say this book is my truth and reconciliation with Kant. And today I'm mostly going to talk about the truth part. And I'm also borrowing the late Charles Mill's way of putting it. He said, we philosophers had two main aims. The first is to make things right. The second is to get things right. And so these days, when I try to make things right, my ultimate goal is to get things right. And so I'll begin by how to make things right. Sometimes the process of making things right can be uncomfortable. And if it's at some point there's sense of discomfort, I invite everyone to walk through discomfort. And this is also my personal philosophy. When I criticize, I never try to tear down. My goal is always to build up better. And so with that, I'm going to give you an overview of the book. I may not be able to finish the entire presentation, which is fine. I think the whole point is that we are going to have a lot of time for conversation. So I'm going to structure today's overview in terms of three ways in which I'm interpreting the subtitle of the book, Views from Somewhere. So the first sense in which I'm talking about view from somewhere is I'm talking about interpreter's viewpoint. And in this case, I'm mostly talking about two basic assumptions that have basically underpinned the majority of conversation about Kant, race, and racism. The first assumption is that there is this contradiction between his moral universalism and the racist aspect of his work. The second assumption is what I call individualistic approach to racism. So that makes up the first part of the book, and then the second part of the book, I focuses on Kant's viewpoint. I wanted to understand how Kant became so interested in the topic of race. And this is an aspect of Kant's scholarship that does not get talked enough about. Kant, all his life, was a natural philosopher, and he began his career as a natural philosopher. So I want to look at how Kant, from the viewpoint as a natural philosopher, became so interested in the topic of race, and how from that standpoint he developed a scientific theory of race. And then the third part of the book is about the viewpoint that has been forever transformed by race thinking. In my understanding, this transformation is really hard, if not entirely impossible, to undo. So in this part, I mostly talk about the legacies of Kant's race thinking. So let me begin with part one. So I think this part for me is the really most important part, in the sense that if we want to move the conversation about Kant, race, and racism forward, it's really important to reflect on our own assumptions. And it is really important to question our own assumptions. And so there I go. So the first assumption is very much ubiquitous in any conversation about historical figures who we admire, but who also held racist views. In general, we'll always say, well, there's a contradiction between some basic values they had that we still appreciate and their racist views. So this is the kind of assumption that is really important to examine, precisely because it has such a hold on our intellectual imagination. So the kind of contradiction that Kant scholars tend to talk about is between his so-called moral universalism and racism. So the moral universalism part, people tend to look at the formula of humanity, which everyone who knows anything about Kant will remember. So I had a relative the other day who mostly got C's and B minuses in college, was trying to tell me what he remembered about. He saw my book, and then he said, this is the part about Kant I remembered. And he got mostly C's in his classes, okay? So I'm not going to repeat that, but I'll return to this one. I'm also not going to repeat the examples of Kant's racist views, which by now should be pretty familiar to most people who are interested in the topic. Anyway, I'll come back to that. So now I'll look at how Charles Mills describes the supposed contradiction between Kant's moral universalism and racism. So the way Charles Mills describes the contradiction is in terms of the scope of application. So on the one hand, Charles Mills says that Kant's moral universalism comes down to this unqualified universalism, unqualified in terms of scope of application. So here's how Charles Mills puts it. Kant holds that all biological humans, including all of the races, are normatively equally human or for persons. On the other hand, Kant's racism comes down to the specific claim about races of, for example, of blacks and Native Americans who are considered natural slaves. And natural slaves in the sense that they're used as mere means by other human beings. And so in this way, Charles Mills set up this kind of binary between two choices, two contradictory choices. Either you focus on Kant's moral universalism, or you focus on his racist particularism. And this binary structure shaped the different camps, right? So on the one camp, in one camp you find Charles Mills, among others, who emphasized the racist aspect of Kant's work. Basically, Charles Mills would say, you cannot just say a great thinker like a Kant held such contradictory views in his head. If you think Kant was so great, you cannot just ascribe a flat out contradiction to him. So according to Charles Mills, Kant must be a consistent and egalitarian. And on the other side, you have most of Kantians and Kant scholars who bite the bullet and think that Kant was just contradicting himself, but we're going to emphasize the good part of his philosophy, namely his universalism. So they read Kant as inconsistent universalist, at least through the 1780s. And so my interpretation is that, the assumption of contradiction actually could not get off the ground in the first place. If we look more closely at Kant's moral universalism, especially as it's articulated through the formula of humanity, we actually cannot really generate the kind of contradiction that Charles Mills was trying to generate. So if you look at the highlighted part, right, you'll see that Kant used in this notion of humanity that cannot be just simply reduced to Charles Mill's notion of biological humans. So let me explain. So in the context of the groundwork, when Kant talks about human being, he's thinking of human being as a rational being as such in abstracto. And so I spend a lot of time talking about a unique Kantian methodology of abstraction by which Kant generated this particular notion of humanity. So it's a complex story. So the short point that I want to make here is that the kind of strict universality of moral claims Kant emphasizes in the moral philosophy, in his pure moral philosophy, cannot be reduced to generalizability over a domain of specific humans, let alone concretely embodied human beings. And then that's, unfortunately, that's what Charles Mills did. He basically reduced Kant's statement about the universality of moral claims to generalizability over this domain of human beings in concreto as embodied and empirically situated beings in different regions of the earth. And I will say in chapter 1 of the book, I argue that this notion of human being is more operative in Kant's physical geography in particular, and this notion of human being constitutes the subject of racialization. So in this book, in this chapter, I try to tease apart different levels of discourse in Kant's writings, and they correspond to pure moral philosophy, at the most abstract level, and then you have pragmatic anthropology at less abstract but still abstract level, and then you have physical geography at the more concrete level. And I'll say there are different notions of human being operative at different level, and Kant, I think, was quite careful about not mixing them up. So once you kind of tease apart these different levels of discourse, then you'll get a sense that Kant has plenty of logical room to talk about race without contradicting his moral claims. So I'll just make it a little bit more concrete. I think the way Kant can make consistent and coherent claims about the so-called inferiority of non-white races has a lot to do with his teleological conception of history. So here's how Kant can link race and destiny together. So back to the level of the distinction between three levels of discourse. So at the most abstract level, Kant was giving an abstract outline of his moral vision about what the ultimate destiny of humanity is here on earth. But he's also concerned with the concrete historical conditions under which that vision can be fulfilled. And the place he talks about that process of realization is in his history essays. So I'm giving you a very brief outline of how, in Kant's view, the different races are placed along the historical trajectory. So what Kant is most interested in is moralization. But Kant also believes that humanity has to deserve its eventual place along this kind of trajectory. So he thinks that humanity as a species has to go through this whole process from the state of nature, through culture, through civilization, and eventually, hopefully, to moralization. But it's going to be a long, arduous journey. And along the way, different races are going to be left behind. And the first that got left behind is the race of the so-called savages, represented by American Indians, according to Kant. They're stuck at the state of nature. And then next, Kant really believes the importance of discipline. And this is represented by the race of the blacks. For Kant, Kant was specifically referring to West African blacks. And so this is a race that represents the basic ability to be disciplined, but nothing more. And next, he does acknowledge that the so-called Orientals, specifically the Orientals that he ascribed to the yellow race, especially Hindus, are capable of certain culture, but only not so fine arts. And the yellow race is supposedly incapable of sciences, including philosophy. And next, the Western Europeans are supposed to be ones who could enjoy the culture of fine arts and sciences and civilization, and eventually, they are the ones who are going to carry the humanity forward toward moralization. Okay, so basically, what you are getting is this kind of coherent picture that has different layers to it. At the most abstract level, again, you have moral knowledge, and then you have anthropological knowledge about human species as a species. And then you get the more concrete geographic knowledge about different human inhabitants on the earth. And when you combine all these together, what you're getting is a pretty salient picture of white man's Eurocentric view of the world and white supremacist notion of the self, and also a sense of entitlement as well as duty to be an agent of historical progress. So I emphasize on this slide, I emphasize Kant as this pragmatically oriented or educator, especially when he was addressing his students. And I love these two portraits of Kant, and so both of these, I think these are the most accurate depictions of Kant's way of philosophizing. I see him not as an armchair philosopher, but as someone who is really attentive to the conditions of the earth. So both of these portraits include globe. Kant was really obsessed with the topic of the earth. Now, so this takes me to the next assumption that Kant scholars tend to make when they talk about Kant and racism. They tend to focus on Kant, the individual. So this is what I call the individualistic approach to racism. So a lot of you are familiar with this debate, right? What I call post-Floyd debate in German public about Kant and racism. And so the leading questions in that debate, especially among some of the leading Kant scholars, prominent Kant scholars, was, first of all, was Kant a racist? As Reza mentioned, there are still people who deny that Kant was a racist at all, right? And then if he was a racist, for how long, right? There was this also narrative that he changed his mind, testament to the strength of his philosophy. And in this debate, they also tend to make some assumptions, methodological assumptions, about how to carve out Kant's, such a big body of Kant's work, including his published works and students' notes of his lectures. So there is this division between Kant's philosophy and Kant the person. This is a very, very familiar move. And then the next one is this distinction between the core and the peripheral. And the core, of course, includes groundwork, among others. And then the peripheral typically includes geography and other so-called minor works. And then the third assumption is that you can we should tease apart Kant's own publications and the notes of his lectures taken by his students. And so we should moreover prioritize the publications. So for me, it's all well and good if our job is to figure out Kant's personal intentions, but I think it's not enough because, again, here I emphasize Kant's role as an educator. One thing that was missed in most of the conversation about Kant and racism is the fact that Kant was not just any individual. He was a powerfully situated social actor. And I emphasize his place in I borrow this from Sally Haslanger, right? In the nexus of power relationships and in the nexus with other meaning-making agents. And Kant was so placed both as a prominent philosopher, Enlightenment thinker, and as a lifelong educator. I care about teaching a lot. By no means I profess to be a great teacher, but at least I recognize the importance of teaching, education, of educating in the classroom. So here in this part, I mostly emphasize Kant's role as an educator. Kant was, again, as I said earlier, Kant was a pragmatic thinker, pragmatically oriented thinker. He was very interested in supplying his students with the world, what he calls the world knowledge that they would need in order to kind of take the world as their stage. Right? That's literally what he said in the appendix to the 1775 essay on race. So I think Kant in this place, if you look at a lot of his lectures, you can pretty much piece together this worldview I mentioned earlier, this self-understanding, the white man's racial self-understanding of his own superiority, of where he is in the history and where his historical mission is supposed to be. So I'm going to skip this part. Actually, there's a very interesting reflection of that construction of white supremacist self-conception in Schiller's inaugural lecture at University of Jena, which Schiller delivered 2 years after he read and was quite impressed by Kant's history essays. I'm not going through them. If you're interested, I go back to these. These are actually quite telling. Okay, so how I'm doing with time? Yeah, I'm good? Okay. So the next 2 parts, I'm going through them quite quickly, hopefully. So the second part of the book, I emphasize Kant's place in what I call an extended process of racial knowledge production during 17th and 18th centuries in particular. So here I emphasize Kant's viewpoint as a natural philosopher. And here I also emphasize his location as his social location as a prominent philosopher whose work people were paying increasing attention to. And so this is something I wrote in chapter 4. I don't think anybody's commenting on chapter 4, so I'll say a little bit about chapter 4. Basically, the way I talk about chapter 4, so chapter 3, I kind of articulated some of Kant's philosophical commitments that he brought to the table when he became interested in the phenomenon of human diversity. But then in chapter 4, I looked at, zoomed out and to see what the 17th and 18th century looked like from Kant's perspective. So in the 17th century, starting with Francis Bacon, in the most clear way, natural philosophers were intentionally soliciting data about all objects, everything you found on Earth, right? So they believe in nature being a book, the second book that God created, right? Besides the Bible. So there's a book of nature to be read. Francis Bacon was really excited by the prospect that finally natural philosophers, because of the discovery of the so-called the New World, natural philosophers were finally able to read the entire book of nature, right? So that was why they solicited all the data and specimens, of course, from all these travelers, and Bacon literally gave an entire list of questions to ask very, very specific questions. What do people eat? And how do they process things? Process of food, and all these kind of things. These questions are not random. So it's fascinating to read Bacon's questions. And the questions, the biggest section of questions Bacon dedicated to the subject of human being. So they were interested in, Bacon did not talk about skin color. They were interested in temperaments, for example. And so it's no accident that by the time Kant was theorizing about human differences, there were already pretty well organized data sets, so to speak, for him to work with. And so, and of course, Bacon was not just the only one. The entire British society, Royal Society, especially with the help of Robert Boyle, basically specified Bacon's list of questionnaire further, and then made skin color, in the process, made skin color a prominent question to ask. So that's why by the time Kant was coming into this conversation in the 18th century, there was so much information about the so-called skin color, right? So this is a context in which, again, the historical backdrop against which Kant was theorizing about race. So that's why I agree that in the sense that Kant was a child of his time, but at the same time, he was also going way beyond them. So I will say a little bit about how he went beyond them. And this part is actually quite important to review why Kant was so proud, I would say, of what he ended up getting, the kind of theory he ended up getting as a natural philosopher. So I'll just quickly talk about Linnaeus and Buffon. And so Linnaeus, I would say, created this kind of, introduced this new paradigm about how to think about human beings, namely humans as mere animals, right? Linnaeus divided the entire book of nature into three realms. You have minerals, you have plants, you have animals, and human beings. That's the important part. Human beings belonged squarely within the animal kingdom. And that was how Kant structured his physical geography lectures. So Kant entirely followed Linnaeus's outline. And then Linnaeus also, of course, gave a fourfold classification of human varieties. But Linnaeus, importantly, did not call them human races. These are varieties. And the difference between these two concepts are really important. If anybody is interested during Q&A, we can talk about this. And then the next thing, another significant paradigm move Linnaeus was making was in the 10th edition of his natural system. That's where he went beyond the skin color and introduced introduced the data, so to speak, about people's temperament, habits of the mind, and treated them as natural effects. So he basically naturalized a lot of aspects of human beings. So now enter Buffon. So what this does to anybody who's interested in natural philosophy, and moreover, in the shadow of Newtonian science, what you would be interested in knowing is that how do all these differences come about? In particular, they were all Christians. They all believed in biblical monogenesis, but they cannot just cite Bible to say, oh, God created the human species, right? So they have to give a scientific account of how the same human species can evolve into so many different varieties. And so this I call the problem, the challenge of scientific monogenesis. And so this was the backdrop. So Buffon, of course, had this theory of degeneration, which Kant still believed in his first essay on race, but eventually abandoned. So what Kant would do against that backdrop, he would critically engage with both Linnaeus's and Buffon's works on human differences. And he would introduce race as a unique concept that is not reducible to the notion of variety. And then the key point I want to make in this chapter was, in a way, this response to Mikhail Wolff in that debate back in 2020. One of the reasons Mikhail Wolff argued that Kant could not have been a racist was that Kant held monogenetic view about human species. That was a huge logical mistake. Just because you believe that all humans belong to the same species does not follow that you're going to treat them kindly. If anything, actually, it can be worse, because then you're forced to fit them all into a single history, and you're forced to try to account for their differences as opposed to superiority and fit them into a single system. So I want to kind of emphasize here that monogenesis for Kant is by no means a compassionate alternative to polygenesis. And the same point can be made about all the people who believed in scientific monogenesis. And I think, to me, that's a really important point, because it's really easy for us to make the mistake that, oh yeah, we're all brothers and sisters. We're good, okay? So, okay. All right. So, moreover, the point I also wanted to drive home in chapter 4 was the point that Kant's scientific theory of race, in the process of theorizing about human differences, right, he arrived at this very potent model, according to him, explanatory model that can explain, right, in a very systematic and law-governed way, according to Kant, methodologically rigorous way, how the same human species can evolve into different varieties. So in the process, he came up with this theory, according to which, also called theory of epigenesis, according to which the original human species, the original human stem, contains the so-called germs and natural predispositions which prepares the human species to survive in any circumstance whatsoever. But those germs have to be developed over time under very concrete material conditions. And depending on how the conditions differ, the development would also differ from one place to the other. To Kant, this is a very powerful model. And I think he would then use that model to kind of tease out practical implications of his race theory. He'll say, and this is important to his moral theory, right? Earlier I said, moralization is not here yet. Kant is interested in how it is possible to realize morality in human species here on Earth. The ground of hope for that realization is that there are germs, moral germs, in the original human species, but those germs have to be developed over time under specific conditions. And these conditions include both internal conditions, such as temperaments, habits of the mind, and things like that, and external conditions, which would be political conditions, among others, and education. So this allows Kant to really kind of finally get this picture about how different human species can fit in different parts of the history of human moralization, right? So he can say, with that model, he can coherently say that the white race, so all these races, they all have the same germs to begin with, but they differ in temperaments, and that difference is not trivial for Kant, because that kind of difference points to the different internal conditions that would affect the development or lack thereof of all these germs. So this lets Kant to the picture that shows how all the other races gets left behind, whereas the white race is right here, and he's very concerned about this bit, working out this bit of conditions for the West Europeans to play at least the agential role to get all the way to moralization. So I'm going to pause here. I may be running out of time. Is that correct? Or I'm good? You're good. You're good? Okay. Oh, very quickly, last bit. Only a couple of slides. So the last bit is basically talking about how once you introduce the concept of race, all of a sudden you actually have this model for understanding all the messy differences. I guess the human being has a desire to fit, things into a structured way. I don't know whether it's the Western tendency or what, but I personally, maybe because I've been educated more or less along the Western educational system, I feel like I also have this tendency to fit things into a neat picture. Now, once you have a concept of race, you actually have what seems to be the right model to put things in the right place. So I want, in this regard, I want to kind of tease out the ways in which race concepts can fundamentally transform how we do things, how we organize our disciplines, how we see ourselves. So chapter 5, chapter 5 actually is a way of responding to an obvious response that I sometimes hear, which is, well, Kant was just wrong, empirically speaking. His race theory, just bunkers. Let's just get rid of it. It's not good. We know better. Let's just move on, right? I don't think that's the right way to respond, because race concepts, once it's kind of introduced, it takes on its own life. It becomes a conceptual tool, not just a representation that can be defeated by further evidence, but a tool by which we organize our conceptions, our perceptions of the world. So we see the world through the racial lens, and it's really hard to unsee. Once you see it, it's really hard to unsee it. And that can have both tragical consequences when the stakes are high. In this case, I used two novellas that pertain to the Haitian Revolution, which happened during the last bit of Kant's life. You can have tragical consequences when you see the world. You're forced to see the world in a way, and yourself through racial lens. But also in the process, I also want to say race concepts can have liberatory potential. This is something I want to explore later in the forward-looking conclusion that will be at the end of this symposium. And so the chapter 6, I basically talk about how Kant was involved in the reshaping of the historical narrative, the historiography of philosophy. I know Eva is going to talk a lot about this. So I'm just going to actually probably stop there. So this part, so again, I've looked at the so-called getting it right part, and then at the end of this symposium, I'll talk a little bit about how to make it right. I have a question mark here, and I have a lot of questions for myself as well. And then at this point, I just want to thank you for your attention.